All right.
All right.
And you should see my screen at this point.
Yep, it's up.
Great. So, hi, everybody. Welcome to Supercharging ASP.NET Core Applications. My name is Nolan Egly. I've been working professionally with computers for a good while and unprofessionally since I was 8 years old. I got bit by the bug early, and it's been a very interesting ride. I love working with them and looking forward to continuing to do so. Um, Quick bio, if you're into that sort of thing, looking at this, I actually had a good laugh. I need to update my LinkedIn. It's circa 2012, so lots of technologies past. Oh, well, I definitely want to update this soon. I am admitting to having Oracle experience, and I definitely don't want to advertise that. VB6, that's okay. Oracle, not quite as much. Um, so I work for a company called Headspring, founded in Austin, Texas. It's a consultancy. We do a number of different things, which means life is never boring. I get a chance to work on a number of different project types, sometimes working on code bases, sometimes doing assessments. Longest I've been anywhere, and it's been great. Um, this is my truth in advertising slide. So thank you for being here. I realize you're carving off an hour and a half of your time to be here. That's time you could be spending with your family, playing video games, out hiking, something. And I want to make sure that you definitely know what you're coming in for. What I'm planning on doing is going through a very small sample app that shows off 4 different libraries: HtmlTags, Fluent Validation, Mediator, and AutoMapper. Sort of highlight the capabilities of these, give some general do's and don'ts based on my personal experience, um, potentially chance to learn from folks here. The code and the slides, I will be publishing those to GitHub afterwards, so you will have access to the code and these slides. I do want to point out that I'm not going to be doing a complete deep dive on any one of these because we're going over 4, going to have to hit the high points, and not also covering any JavaScript front ends. So if this isn't exactly what you were thinking it was going to be based on the description, definitely not going to be offended if you have other priorities and you would prefer to spend your time elsewhere. But moving on, we're going to look at HTML tags. We're going to look at Fluent Validation, AutoMapper, both the raw auto mapping capabilities, and then I want to talk about how to optimize that when you're pulling from the database. We're going to look at the tool Mediator, and I'm probably not going to get to vertical slices. When I did a dry run last night, I was already sitting at about 90 minutes by the time I got to vertical slices, and I'm just going to drop that. But I will point you to other talks that cover it very well in depth that will be worth your time later. So HTML tags. HTML tags is a library for, well, composing HTML, but the single biggest benefit for it is you're using C# classes to generate them. This allows you to standardize how you're building common structures in the application, and it can help cut down on errors from having boilerplate code in a number of different places. So, wait, I know you disclaimed no JavaScript, but what about React or Angular or Blazor? And just in brief, it's good to remember that not every project makes decisions based solely on technological choices. You may have a team that isn't familiar with JavaScript, You may have a team that has other constraints to where just simple server-side rendering, for whatever reason, is going to be the best fit. So if you really prefer JavaScript to server-side, stick around after HTML tags. From there back, it's all going to be server-side. So I did want to disclaim that it's always difficult when you're working with sample code to have something big enough to be realistic that doesn't make it look like this is ridiculous, these like industrial techniques for just a couple of screens. Just keep that in mind as we're looking at 2 or 3 screens as we're going through the code. The business domain that I've picked is working with volunteers, looking for organizations to spend time with. So in the app, we have applicants, people who want to volunteer with an organization. We have volunteers that have been approved, thought being applicants would be coming in some sort of front end, and then volunteers would be screened and vetted in a back office process. Wasn't able to fully implement that within this. And then for individual volunteers, that you would have a history of the organizations that you had volunteered with and how many hours that you had spent with them. So at a high level, that's what we have for the business domain. Naturally, we have a backing database. We have the applicants. We have volunteers, which will have a list of volunteer hours, which are associated with a particular organization. So tags gets wired up in the application startup. It's just a simple one-liner, and you pass in your class of conventions that you would like to apply throughout the entire application. So let's take a look at some of the low-level tags first, and then we'll take a look at how you can composite them together. Yeah, wrong one. So here on line 19, we are referencing a method on HTML tags to generate a label and then an input further after. Where are we running? So here on the form, we have 4 different fields that we need to input. These are the very low-level methods that you can use when you need to. And as I mentioned, these are all fluent as far as being able to call extra methods to manipulate the HTML. With tag helpers and HTML helpers, you can pass in dictionaries of properties, but here you get true C# methods to be able to build and interact with the objects. So here we have our label, our input, our validation, but then the other 3 are all being built up with this form block method. So if we dial into that and we sort of read through, we see that we're getting a div tag created with the class form group being applied to it. We're creating a label and then also building up our input. We're making our adjustments to it, including adding any attributes that we want. Here, we're turning off autocomplete, and then also building up our validation span. All of this is in this one method, which allows us to build something like this, all with this one builder method across the different data points on your model. It's very easy to do a one-off if you need to change something. So here we're adding text to the label that's been programmatically put together. So email, please no fakes. One challenge that you may have when you're mixing HTML tags and tag helpers or the other helper interfaces is when you go to start calling HTML, you will need to look very carefully at the methods and where they are coming from in order to pick the ones from HTML tags instead of the built-in ones. I haven't really determined a great way around that other than completely turning off the Microsoft classes. And that happens because they're both implementing the same iHTML helper interfaces, just something to be aware of. So in addition to labels and inputs, you can also do display blocks, so read-only blocks. So these are, look at the page first. Details. So up here at the top, just pairs of, hey, here's the read-only data that we want to put out. And something, I'm not going to go exhaustively into it, but you should be aware that the support for display is not completely working in HTML tags at this point. And if you want to have them, you will have to sort of expose some of the classes yourself, which I've rolled up here in this HTML fixes. These are making references to some of the internals in order just to make these methods publicly accessible. Quite often, code bases will just simply render them out without having this sort of structure, but that's just something to be aware of if you do want to leverage the displays heavily. So the data, you can control how it gets rendered out by applying conventions. This was the class that we passed into our configuration startup. And in here, we're doing a number of setups that will be applied to all of the tags that we build throughout the system. So as we were looking at labels and inputs earlier, every single label that we build is automatically going to have the control label class added to it. So instead of having to have a form like this, where you've got div class form group, adding the form labels, all of these attributes that turn into boilerplate as you're setting up a number of fields on a form, you can programmatically control those across the entire application. And so if chances are you're not going to completely gut and redo these, but you could without having to completely search and replace through all of them and across the entire app. Let's see. For date pickers or for properties that have a date, all of those across the app are going to have a placeholder of the American convention date, month, year automatically added. And we're also specifying that how we want those to render as a short date string. So if we go and we look at creating a new volunteer where we've got the join date here, we see we have the placeholder filled in for us automatically. And if we want to flip this, yeah. And then I'd also intentionally left this commented out earlier. If I want to apply the appropriate data attribute for whatever date picker technology I'm using, I can do this. And by virtue of the data type on our join date here being a date time, it's just going to automatically get applied. So if we go back, and we have our date picker. Did I mistype? I think I mistyped or retyped the exact same layout that was already on there, didn't I? I did. Well, you see, adding the date provider kicking in and giving us a fancy bootstrap picker instead. One of the more advanced techniques that I'm really fond of is very easily rendering your dropdowns based on the values in your domain model. So if we go and we look at Charlie Brown here, and we need to edit how many hours that he's volunteered at CAPS-RS. Here we have a drop-down with all of the different organizations in the database that we can choose. And let's suppose he was actually doing that at Second Chance, and it was actually 18 hours. This drop-down is getting populated from the contents of the organization table in the database. And tags gives us a very easy way to render those. If we look at the details edit page, and we see that this is all we're doing to specify how this is getting rendered out. It's just, hey, it's a form block on the organization here, which is a C# class. What we've been able to set up in our conventions is a builder for whenever we have a reference to an organization. We're telling tags, use the C# code to build that. And looking at the implementation, we've got a couple of methods for getting the value for it, and then getting the name or the display. Here we're wiring up which properties on our organization we want to pull those from. So this could be the name, this could be the short name, which could be the description, and whatever property on our organization we want to show up in the dropdown. And furthermore, when it's going to render that dropdown, you can also tell it how you want to select what's getting shown. So here in this source method, we're getting our entity framework context, and from our organization table, we want to sort these by name, which they are. So it gives a lot of easy flexibility in how you want to poll and then display the data in your dropdowns. This is coming off of a base class, entity select element builder, which is doing all of our heavy lifting. And then just per domain type, just the core, and here's the value and the name, and here's how to grab it. It's also really easy to tell it how to hide IDs or row versions. So you typically have to hold on to the ID of the record you're modifying, so you can send it back to the database. And the way we've configured HTML tags here is if the name of the property ends in ID, unless we're specifically asking to show it, because sure enough, you'll have that one property that ends in ID that's not an ID. We want to build that with a hidden tag. And so here we can just HTML.input, and by virtue of being an ID or a row version, those will get rendered invisibly inside the form. I've seen a number of different UI widgets get composed with HTML tags because it is so extensible, and I've seen graphics of tables for compression engine readings of a number of different cylinders. You can build a dashboard readout of metrics, cards of information for a student with multiple sections in it. And those can all be just different HTML tag methods to build up those different items with the data that you're passing in. You do want to be careful not to try to build too much in one single method. So as we were looking at form block, we're just taking one input and one label. You might be tempted to have something like HTMLTags.build build organization and employee structure list. And you could end up passing so much information in that it becomes really difficult to debug the method, or it becomes difficult to change and understand. A good rough rule of thumb is your tag buildup methods should roughly parallel the structure of the data structure that you're representing. So whatever repeating item you have, you probably are going to want to have a standalone method for that inside some sort of loop for rendering it. It's very powerful. Just spend some time thinking about the granularity for the methods that you want to build up with. The only real downside is that there's not a lot of documentation for this particular library. So you are probably going to want to carefully look at an example that's using it the first time that you're playing with it, either this code base or the sample site that it comes with. So that would be a good place to stop and see if we have questions about HTML tags. I am looking at a minimized window trying to see how to get back to the chat here.
That can sometimes be challenging.
I wonder if it's because I'm presenting.
It might. It's if you look for your Teams icon, you might be able to spot the other window, and you could click on it to open it up. But yeah, maybe because you're presenting, it's hard to say. There's not.
Oh, here we go.
There's not really much in the way of questions right now in the chat, but.
Okay.
But there also might be a weirdness with the chat. I've got a strange message up top saying that some people may not have access to it for some reason.
Okay.
So if anybody does have a question, if you want to use the raise your hand feature, then we could get your question out there. Not seeing anybody raise their hands, so.
All right, we can press on.
Press on.
So Fluent Validation is a small library for writing validation rules. And the single greatest reason to use it is not directly coupled to the model that you're validating with, as is the case with data annotations. And this gives a lot more flexibility in dealing with interesting variations where your validation could end up getting spread across multiple different objects. So this also wires up in the startup. And one nice thing about Fluent Validation is it can live side by side with the built-in validation. So if you have an existing project where you would like to start applying or experimenting, you can wire it up and use it and try it out in a couple of new places without affecting any of the existing application. So if we go back to the volunteer create page, so here we have our validator for a request to create a volunteer. We have Fluent build-up methods for specifying the property that we want to apply some validations to. And then you can daisy chain whatever's appropriate for that particular property. So for email, we can specify can't be empty, and the maximum length should be 500. And then I went a little crazy in the example. I went straight for, well, let's something complex that was a little harder to do with the annotations. So here we have on the email that if the email contains the first name or the email contains the last name and the name happens to be mine, that I'm going to get a personalized message. Nolan, don't register with your personal email address. So here we're able to access all of those properties on the object and coordinate whether or not this is valid, all in the same place that we also have our more straightforward validations. I mentioned you can apply a mix and match strategy. So here we see that the validations on first and last name, those are actually the traditional attributes that work well for single fields. So if we flip over to creating an applicant, so here we see we're hitting that complex validation for checking against the name portions and the email. I also had another example over in the applicants create. Well, I went through them backwards. All right, so this one's actually the more boring example. We ended up going straight for maximum ridiculousness or maximum flexibility with our tool there. So this is showing applying all of the attributes solely with Fluent Validation without any attributes on our incoming object. So it's very straightforward. It gives you a place to put all of the validations in just one particular object. And it's very, very flexible with what you can do with it. This doesn't happen very often, but if you do end up in a situation where you need to take some of your code and run it in some sort of back-end process separate from a web application, you can still pull your validation classes if you still need them for some reason, and you can run these validations manually with Fluent Validation. In the web app here, this is getting wired up and fired automatically. But just like with annotations, if you need to run them manually for some reason, you do have that option. And this isn't a particular override that I used, but I did want to mention it just as another example of showing how easy it is to access the whole object, do exactly what you need in C# code to validate your object. It does support client-side validation. So when you do the built-in template with .NET Core, by default, it is going to wire up all of the client-side validation scripts in jQuery. And most of the built-in validation will work with that, but not all of it. As you would expect, if you do something complex or custom with the validation, the conditional clauses, those sorts of checks are only going to work server-side. And sort of some of the tripwires that you can run into. When I first started using this framework, this is great. I can do absolutely everything in this because it's all C# in one class. And I actually had custom validators that would take in a database context in the constructor, and that I would use it to start doing some of the back-end business validation as well. Like, this username has to be unique, or let me go make sure that all of the accounts that you're trying to close have all posted for the month. Try to avoid this temptation. There's the obvious problem that you're starting to mix the very simple, did you actually fill out the form validation before you pushed the button, with potentially some back-end operations that put extra performance load on the system, which could have been avoided. But then it also makes it more difficult to test these validation conditions, and the validators can get complex and a little tricky to reason through from mixing these two different types of validations. So just keep in mind the two different types of validation that you'll tend to run into. You have the simple data record kind of validation. Think, you're filling out a form. Did I fill this out? What's the maximum length? Is this number really a number? And then you have more the business logic validation that's things like, this has to be a unique entry. Make sure the accounts have all closed before you do the postings, things like that. One of my favorite things that Fluent Validation enables is being able to easily have a save draft feature. I haven't implemented it in this small sample code base, but I've had several applications where the client has requested, hey, we want to be able to partially fill out the form, and when we submit it in full, we should check all the validations, but because the form's so big, we only want to save part of it and to be able to have a draft. And with Fluent Validation, it's possible to accommodate that a little easier than it is with an approach where your validations are hard associated with the properties on your object. And just a very example of a scenario that Fluent Validation can help enable. Questions about Fluent Validation?
Don't see any questions in the chat. Anybody would like to raise their hand and if they just have a question they want to ask, we can do that.
All right.
All right, soldier on.
So AutoMapper, chances are, if you're heard of or familiar with any of these tools already, this is probably the one that you've already heard of, just guessing from download counters on NuGet. And so single greatest benefit for AutoMapper is cutting down on the boilerplate code of assigning from one object to another, and then also helping to enforce a convention for how things are named throughout your system. I've heard or seen a lot of, I guess, frustrations with AutoMapper that in some cases result from, I guess, over-enthusiastic use of it. And so I wanted to just take a moment to sort of pause on the big picture. Why do mapping in the first place? And the docs actually spell it out very well. And rather than try to phrase it myself, I thought I would liberally borrow. And it's very useful when you're crossing some sort of boundary, for example, from a user interface into your domain model, or if you're needing some sort of DTOs just for data transmission, sending JSON to a backend or something along those lines. And so if you're not actually finding yourself along some sort of boundary like this when you're using it, it may be a gratuitous use. That's just something to keep in mind. So like the others, this gets wired in the startup. And then what we're passing in here is just a marker type for what assembly should AutoMapper go and look for the mapping files. Looking at a very simple example first. So here, when we have a incoming request to create an applicant, which we have our first name, last name, and email, we are taking that incoming request and automatically mapping it to this particular domain type. So translating from type command from the browser to applicant, which is our domain model. Here we have our ID for the database and so forth. If we weren't using AutoMapper, we would end up doing something along the lines of you have first name, you have last name. Not code that's hard to write, but definitely very repetitive. And by using AutoMapper, all we have to do is call map, and it will automatically do that translation for us. In order for that to work, you do have to provide it with a map, which we have up here. I tend to prefer to keep these close to the objects that are actually being mapped as opposed to one central repository. Those files tend to get really big if you store all of your maps in one place. It's handy to have it close to the actual types that are being mapped. You just descend from the mapping profile, and then in your constructor, if you don't have to customize anything, if all of your types line up by name already, then all you have to do is call create map. Looking at something a little more interesting. So this is the volunteer. Nope. Oh, yes. Here we go. Sorry. So looking here at this screen, we have our root object, which is the volunteer, but then we also have a list of assorted data with Charlie Brown here. The list of the hours that he's volunteered, which is composed of the name of the organization type, how many hours that they've put in there, and how that's getting rendered out in the UI. I think I'm on the wrong page here. Yep, here we go. Sorry about that. So here in the UI, we have our root project, our root properties of our volunteer. And then we also have a list of their volunteer hours. And this has the name of the organization, has this badly named, but we'll explain that momentarily here, property for the organization type, and then how many hours they volunteered. And so we're reading this from the database, and this is coming from a number of different tables and a structure where we have the volunteer hours, which have links to the organization, which an organization has a link to the organization type, all underneath our volunteer here. But we only have to do the two maps. So for the volunteer to the result in order to get the core volunteer properties, and then for our list of hours, mapping that to the volunteer hour. And then in order to get it to resolve the organization type, we're specifying from this particular property, we want to map that from this particular navigation across the object. Out of the box, AutoMapper will intelligently parse the names for you based on Pascal case. So we have a volunteer hour that has a organization. And then on the organization, we have a name here on line 15. So AutoMapper will look at that, and it will automatically flatten it by parsing out those different parts, assuming that those separations in the capitalization is the navigation across the object. So off the volunteer hour, on the organization, and then off the organization, grab the name. And it can do that for us automatically. This alone helps drive a convention for how you name your objects, because the more you follow this, the less custom mapping that you'll have to do. And so if you're in a code base where AutoMapper is being heavily leveraged, you'll get to where you just start to look at this and be mentally parse through, oh, I know exactly where that's coming from based on the object associations off the backing domain model. The problem I ran into on the organization type is because we have two words here, AutoMapper started to look for something called type off of organization, which organization does not have something called type. It has organization type. And so this one I had to do a manual mapping on. If you have a case where your properties don't line up in names for some reason, so for example, if we were to do something like this, so here we have this non-matching, and optionally we want to map this off of number of hours. something like this. It is possible also if your incoming model and your outgoing model can be flipped. So if there's a lot of congruence between the two, there aren't extra properties coming from different places, you can actually specify that a map is reversible. So under the detail edit, where we had a one-for-one, what we were showing on the screen and what we were editing was exactly the same in the domain model, just the who's the organization and what are the number of hours. We can use this call to reverse map to indicate that not only can we go from volunteer hour into our command object going out to the browser, but when the browser sends it back, we can reverse that from the command coming from the browser back into our domain model, all with just one little call. If you don't use that, what you end up doing is actually declaring two separate mappings, something along these lines. Which isn't the end of the world, but it's just a nice little shortcut to I don't have it in this particular code base, but something that's very useful in your automated tests is to set up a test to call AutoMapper and assert, is the mapping configuration valid? Because these get compiled dynamically at runtime, it's possible to have an error, and you won't actually know it at the time you compile. You'll find out when you actually go to run. And so having a test that calls this will allow you to detect automatically that there's a problem before you actually run the application. I've never had to use this, but it's also possible to ask AutoMapper to print out a execution plan for exactly how it's going to translate two types. If you have a lot of customizations that you're having to do, this could potentially come in handy as you're trying to figure out why things aren't mapping the way you think they should. Talked about the conventions for it, about how out of the box, based on Pascal, which is the uppercase convention, that it will parse out your hierarchies for you. If you need to override that for some reason, for example, if you're doing some JSON serialization and you have the much more common camel case, or maybe you're dealing with kebab case, I don't know. You can actually set it 4 different conventions based on those particular needs. So I'm not showing this in the sample code base, but there's a variety of ways you can customize your mappings if you need to. If you need to ignore a property because you have something that you want to set manually, maybe it's a timestamp, like what is the current time, something along those lines. You can tell AutoMapper to ignore a particular property that you're outputting to, and then set it yourself separately. If you have some sort of special scenario where you just really need to programmatically do mappings between objects for some reason, you can add your own custom types or objects into AutoMapper to do resolving for you. If you have a particular data type that you need translated in a particular way, or if you just need a converter for an entire type. So this is what, if you need to ignore something because it's not actually going to be mapped to. Don't want to bog down on the others. What I wanted to get to is projection. So when you're querying from the database, by default, what you're going to get back from the ORM are all of the fields in the particular objects that you're querying from. But frequently, when you're working with AutoMapper and when you're not actually going to need all of those fields. You just end up needing to gather them from multiple different tables. So here in this particular list, on a volunteer, we're wanting to look up the name of the organization and the type of the organization, along with the hours that they've served. But there's a lot of other properties we're not polling. We're not polling the row versions for concurrency checks. We're not polling the longhand descriptions. We're only grabbing one or two properties from each of these. But when you go to run the query, as you do your includes on your query, Entity Framework is by default going to actually grab all of those fields for you. Details page. So here in this method, we are querying Entity Framework for the volunteers. We're asking to include the volunteer hours. And then so that we can get those names, the name of the organization and the name of the organization type, we're including these other tables so that they can be mapped out. And when you look at the SQL, if you run a profile, and it's not terribly readable, so I've cheated, and in advance I've cleaned this up, but this is the query that you're getting from Entity Framework when we're asking for the volunteer details, those other fields along with the volunteer. If we read through it, we can see that when it's going out to the organization, we're getting not just the name, but also the description and the row version, these other properties that we're just not really interested in.
Hey, Nolan, you might need to bump the font up just a little bit on that.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry.
No worries.
And there we go.
Much better.
Yeah. Remembered Visual Studio. I forgot I was going to drop into here too. And so if we run this, somehow I've managed to hit show to grid or show. There we go. So just lots of fields that we're not even showing, we're not interested in, but we're making the database go through the work of polling anyway. So what Entity Framework supports is being able to do projection to where before it starts to send the results back, you can tell it what you want to select out of it. If we do that manually, what that looks like is starting a select statement, and then inside that, telling Entity Framework exactly which properties or fields that we're wanting to pull off, and then manually building our result object ourselves here. So here we're only polling just the organization name and the name of the organization type. And if we look at the SQL that generates, it's a lot less fields that it's polling and a lot less results coming back from the database. But nobody really wants to have to do this manually, right? So it's great that this is here, that we can give hints to Entity Framework. Hey, these are the only things we really want to select back. And so what we might try to do is to, I know, we'll call AutoMapper inside our select statement here. Well, as you can probably guess by the method name here, this actually isn't going to work because the queryable interface from Entity Framework has a very limited amount of operations that it supports. They have to be directly translatable into SQL. So it can understand, hey, assign this field to this object or this property on my object, but once you start calling methods on classes or start doing other things, it just can't translate that. It has to give up, and it's going to fall back into doing this server side after it's made the call to the database. So what the AutoMapper project did was introduce an extension that allows us to shim into that select in the queryable, where this is still happening on the database side with this project to extension method. So when we use this, what AutoMapper will do is it will dynamically issue those same selects that we were looking at earlier that we were building up manually. And it will build those out for us automatically based on our profile mapping. And so when we query like this, we will be a lot kinder to what all we're pulling back from the database. So possible tripwires when you're working with AutoMapper, it is really powerful, really easy to customize. Just be careful that where it's being used, typically that's going to be at some sort of boundary. Most often that's going to be the UI and your domain layer. If one symptom that you're possibly using it too much and actually making life hard on yourself is if you have a pipeline of multiple map steps for one single operation. I've actually seen this, and very annoying to have to figure out, okay, this type goes to this type, and then this type goes to that type, but it's all within the same sort of general process, and it's not really having to be translated. You also want to beware of getting sucked into having to do a lot of customization. Rough rule of thumb, if you're having to customize more than 20% of the fields in your mappings, that's a good red flag that maybe AutoMapper's not a good fit and that you're going to spend more time fiddling with AutoMapper than you are just actually manually doing the assignments back and forth. There is a small risk of performance problems because the maps are dynamically compiled. Theoretically, if you have enough mappings, you could have a bit of a hit when the app starts up. Realistically, I've never run into that into production. I'd be curious if anyone on the call has. So the upsides, it can really cut down on x.foo equals y.foo. The only real downsides are it does have a bit of a magic feel to it. If you have younger team members, newer team members that aren't familiar with it, they could potentially be confused about how some things are happening. Thoughts or questions about AutoMapper?
Have you ever used it for doing data conversions or migrations, something like that? Or is that the wrong tool?
So when you say a data conversion, do you mean something along the lines of, I have a database for medical product A, and we're going to start using medical product B instead, but I need to move all my Sure.
Yeah, application migration, bring onboarding a new client, something like that.
That's a great question. I'm not aware of anybody who's done that. Typically, I've fallen back to pure SQL in an iterative fashion to be able to run through and do bits of it in pieces. Could you? You could. I guess my main concern would be how evident some of the errors that you may run into as you are hitting various problems, such as type conversions. So, for example, going from one data type to another. Also, just thinking roughly about the time that you would spend, I guess, defining the C# classes to mirror the data structure of both of the databases. I guess you could script that. So you could do some fancy T-SQL to script out the schema, spit out the appropriate C# classes, and then start working it from there.
I was thinking it would be great, I've never done anything like that myself. We are using AutoMapper and Mediator at my office, but we, we often have, a conversion group or DBAs working on these, extracts and conversions and that kind of thing. And we also have a problem where we do a lot of support fixes that wind up going in, being scripted in to fix data as opposed to, fixing the application and, doing something else. And, it would be nice to have something like using some sort of import-export mechanism along with Mediator to map to your classes that also use maybe like the Fluent Validation to validate the data that they're putting in there so that we don't have, problems, with the data.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought exercise. I've actually done data conversions earlier in my career, and I can sympathize certainly with the way that you end up usually. It's never clean, right? You get the data from somebody and they assure you, oh, it's well formatted, and you find all of the weird entries from 10 years ago as the software product they were using went through bug fixes and the way it wrote data changed. And so I don't know, that's an interesting thought. I'm not aware of anybody who's done it, and I'm somewhat intrigued by it. I think the person doing it, obviously they would have to be more of a developer than more your typical DBA. And so if you had somebody who had those skills and maybe not quite as good at handwriting SQL, I think that might be the best possible fit for that. I think otherwise it feels like just extra ceremony on top of the SQL that's going to happen anyway. But if you try that, I would definitely love to hear about how that goes.
Hey, Nolan, Randy Russell here. Interesting tool. I like it. I just think there might be some large-scale problems communicating with a database.
As far as the scenario we were just talking about for doing a data migration.
I mean, as far as entity framework, that may not work in a large-scale application. You'd be better off calling sort of procedures that, basically, did the work for you in a more efficient way.
Sure. And so that definitely comes down to, I guess, developer familiarity with what exactly is happening when they're using entity framework here. I think this is more of an entity framework or an ORM sort of specific concern than it is AutoMapper. The problem that we're illustrating of we're grabbing the whole world to populate this list is happening with or without it. And I'm fortunate that when I started early in my career, my mentor was actually a database administrator. And so I got schooled very hard on, you will not query for things that you're not actually doing something with. He made me learn how to write SQL. And so I have that understanding of how these queries work. If you have a developer who's starting out and they learn how to use an ORM, whether that's Entity Framework or it's in Hibernate or it's Dapper or any of the other tools that are out there, they can definitely end up in that unfortunate situation if somebody doesn't help them as they're writing code, if people don't review it and sort of show them, hey, here's what's happening behind the scenes based on that C# that you just wrote, then that definitely can be an issue. And so my thought there is you have to balance the skills or the training that you can put into the developers that you're working with and come to that sort of realization of which is going to be better, having the developers who really understand how to build this the right way, or is it easier and quicker because we've got great DBAs who have a store of stored procedures on tap? Maybe we could just call those instead. And so that's going to look different at every organization, has been my experience. But that is a great point that you want to make sure that that understanding and that profiling is happening.
Yeah, I think your mixture of C# and HTML code and the way this all works out, it's a pretty cool tool. But I am concerned about database communications. There's a large scale using Entity Framework is probably not a good idea.
Well, it can work really quite well if it's used appropriately, even on very, very large databases. And I'm sure you've also seen people that write stored procedures. Back in the day, for a while, it was the trend to use stored procs for everything, right? Even the CRUD operations. And sometimes you saw really, really bad stored procedures written very inefficiently, just because they didn't know any better. So hopefully, with the right tools and the right training, we can get great results.
Yeah.
I think we can all probably argue the differences between Entity Framework and stored procedures, and we would never come to a consensus at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I use both in almost every application.
I just, at the end of the day, I just want to have fun. Okay. I think this is a great presentation, Nolan. You showed me something that I didn't see before, and I was very impressed. Thank you.
So looking at the clock, we've got about 15 minutes left. I at least want to give lip service to Mediator, if everyone could sort of humor me for maybe another 5 to 7 minutes. And I understand Ken's actually got a drawing. If at least you're not getting anything out of the talk, you can hold out hope that maybe you'll get some cool prizes afterwards. So Mediator is a tool that allows you to flexibly separate the request for something to happen and the actual handling of that. Probably the biggest example that I see is you've had a request in the UI and you want to handle that in the back end and keep that separate so you don't have those concerns mixing together. In Mediator, there's basically two types of messages that you may deal with. You have request responses. So, hey, I want to get some data about a student, or maybe, hey, I want to save some data on a student. And then you can also do notifications. Notifications are really useful when you have two things that are separate. So for a student, you may have an address service, and you may also have a graduation service that is impacted when the student moves. And the concerns for those two services or classes or maybe totally different, but yet one still needs to tell the other that something interesting has happened. And Mediator makes it possible for the one end to simply send a message, not really know who's listening, not really care, and then listeners can receive messages without having to really have explicit references to whatever is actually publishing those. So it's great for helping keep things decoupled that still need to communicate with each other. It does have a concept of pipelines, and I wanted to mention that because those pipelines can have behavior that if you're not familiar with that, you may see things happen and not be sure, like, well, how did that happen? The way the pipelines in the sample code here are set up is you'll have a logger a log handler that will log what's happening. You have another pipeline element that will open up a database transaction for you automatically. And then the actual logic handling the message will fire, and then it will undo that stack through the pipeline in reverse, where the database pipeline is committing your transaction for you, and your logging pipeline is closing it out for you. If we look at the wire up here in our example app, here's where we're registering Mediator, and then here are those pipelines that I was talking about. The order that you add them to the services is the order that these will fire when Mediator handles a request. So here, this one's just simply doing
right now.
Oh, am I? Wow. I apologize. Somehow
You're not sharing at the moment.
Yeah. I wonder how that happened.
Yeah, well, you kind of screwed up the screen there, Nolan.
There we go.
We'll
Better?
blame Randy. Much better.
Great. So here's where we're registering it, and then this is the order the pipelines will fire in. Here in the logging pipeline, we're just logging what's happening, and then in our transaction pipeline, here we're opening and committing the transaction automatically. Any of these endpoints, we've actually been looking at Mediator already. So here we have, when we're posting, we're calling Mediator, passing our data coming in off the browser straight in. And then we have a handler that's capable of processing these command messages down here. So by virtue of implementing this interface, the runtime knows that when this gets dispatched, that this is the handler that can handle that particular message. So what makes this very useful, other than the occasional I need to notify from one place to another, and they don't really shouldn't really have references to each other. What makes this very useful is you're immediately separating all of your processing logic from your UI. In this particular case, that's ASP.NET.Core. You could also apply this in a full client application, XAML, WPF, etc. And it allows all of your logic to remain decoupled from the UI concerns, which makes it a lot easier to test. And if you have complex scenarios where you need to do one thing and then do another, you could actually modify your controller to simply call those multiple message types. So that was a very abbreviated introduction to Mediator, but any questions or thoughts on it before I turn it back over to Kenny? Okay. So I mentioned vertical slices and that I probably wouldn't go into that. I will simply really highly recommend the either of these articles. Excuse me. Top one's an article. The lower one is about an hour-long presentation at the Norwegian Developer Conference. The talker, Jimmy Bogard, does an excellent job outlining vertical slice architecture that you end up with when you leverage Mediator. And he also does a great job talking about queries and commands and how to do this separation and the advantages that you have when you do that. Thank you. I mentioned I will post the slides and the code up to, I'll put those on my GitHub repository. If I don't do it tonight, I will definitely have it done over the next day or so. One of the virtues of having a fairly unique name, I'm pretty easy to find on whichever platform. It's just always Nolan Egly. Thank you for taking the time to hang out.
I think we got, somebody was asking if there is some good online resources for learning Mediator.
The wiki isn't too bad as far as understanding, I guess, sort of the intent of how your app will get structured from it, and then the differences between the queries and the commands and what you should put in one over the other. I am going to, again, recommend that vertical slices presentation where he spends an hour going into those concepts and how to structure those individually. I do feel a little bad saying, oh, watch a video, because I realize you can't speed read that, but it really is an excellent resource.
Cool. Well, I'll get those links and include them along with the YouTube copy of this talk when we get that posted too.
Anything else, or
let's see, we got one question down there about does the message get persisted somewhere, or does it work across two different systems?
That's a great question, and starting to speed through, I didn't make a point that I really meant to. Mediator is not meant for distributed systems. It's not a message queue like Rabbit or mine's blanking. Yes, and any of those. I was trying to think of the one, MSMQ.
MSQ, yeah.
That's the one I was trying to think of and lost the name on. So Mediator is strictly in memory, and so you'll use it to help keep separation and to help keep decoupling within a process running in memory, but it does not span systems, and it does not have any sort of built-in storage for messages. So on the page, we have mediator.send. If the power were to go out at that point, that message is gone. It was not persisted anywhere.
Yeah, so more like a message pump you'd find in a lot of the MVVM frameworks.
Yes, it's meant to be used within a single system and not to coordinate across systems. You would use any of those other tools that we just mentioned for those scenarios. Great question, and thank you for making me clarify that. The eShop on web, I looked at it very briefly, and they have examples both ways, both with and without it. Yes.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ones you have to figure out. There's a couple of different versions of the eShop on web, but yeah, if you browse out there, I think you can fun stuff.
Cool.
If you look at Jimmy Bogard's GitHub, as far as mediator resources, he has also got a sample app showing how to use it. It's going to look very similar to what we've just walked through, but that is another code base if you'd like a variety of opinions. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. And as I said, we've got a couple of winners. So Amal and Ed, if you would email me, kenross@microsoft.com, then I will send you back the certificates for the JetBrains licenses, so you can get a 1-year subscription to pretty much anything they have. Any one thing, not like everything. Thanks everybody for coming out. Appreciate it as always. I hope you had a great time, and we'll see you next month back at the Atlanta.net users group.
Thank you.
Yep.